Okay, now the dermis. So the dermis is deep to the epidermis, and it actually has two layers. The more superficial layer is called the papillary layer, and it consists of loose areolar connective tissue. It is a much thinner layer than the deeper reticular layer that consists of dense, irregular connective tissue with many elastic fibers. Collagen fibers extend from the papillary layer to the reticular layer and from the reticular layer to the underlying subcutaneous layer. The collagen fibers knit together the layers tightly so that skin doesn't get pulled off from any kind of friction with the environment. Okay? Skin is amazingly strong, tough, and elastic. And if you look at the picture here, they have the papillary layer shown with a scanning electron microscope, and you see that the papillary layer has areolar connective tissue that is finer and smoother looking than the underlying dense, irregular connective tissue that you can just about see in that picture. Then there is the reticular layer, which is the dense, irregular connective tissue with the collagen bundles going this way and that way, every which way. And then finally, the subcutaneous layer, which has a lot of adipocytes, these round, puffy looking fat cells, mixed in with areolar connective tissue, which has an open framework but with some collagen fibers and elastic fibers in it. Oh, the superficial papillary layer contains the dermal papillae that interlock with the epidermis. And in the papillary layer of the dermis, blood vessels branch into capillaries, and large nerves branch into fine nerve endings that go right up to the epidermis and supply the epidermis. The capillaries don't enter the epidermis, but there are some fine nerve endings called free nerve endings that actually do enter all the way into the epidermis. Now, hair follicles, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands are epidermal structures that actually dive down from the epidermis during development all the way down, sometimes in the case of hair follicles, all the way down through the dermis, both the papillary layers and the reticular layers, and all the way to the subcutaneous layer. So the hair follicles, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands are seen in the papillary layer of the dermis because they're, extending downward through the papillary layer. Then we get to the reticular layer, and similarly, the reticular layer has the hair follicles, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands that have dove down from the epidermis into them. The dermis reticular layer has larger blood vessels and nerves that supply the reticular layer of the dermis and the papillary layer, both. I think looking at the picture, you get what I'm talking about, right? Okay, here's a kind of large enlarged picture, so you can look at the different parts of the dermis, the papillary layer and the reticular layer, and the structures that are found in them. And now about tension lines. Many collagen and elastic fibers in skin are arranged in parallel bundles. I know that we're thinking about dense irregular connective tissue and the fact that it goes this way and that way in the dermis, but many of the collagen and elastic fibers in skin are actually arranged not just in a random way, but in parallel bundles that resist the stresses that are placed on the skin with normal movements, which makes sense, right? Evolutionarily, over time, the way that the bundles of collagen and elastic fibers are arranged was slowly, over evolutionary time, like morphed into the best possible way for them to be arranged so that we could live and reproduce and pass on our genes, right? So these parallel fiber bundles create tension lines. And if you look over here, here's a person with the tension lines in their skin shown. And they are all over our skin. You can discover them on yourself by looking closely on your skin. Okay. and you will see them. Okay. Clinically, tension lines are important when you're doing surgery. You want to cut along a tension line, parallel to a tension line, because it is easier for the body to heal a cut that occurs along a tension line than to heal a cut that is made across a tension line. This is because when you cut across a tension line, the elastic fibers in the bundles retract, and as the wound is healing, the fibers have a harder time knitting together, and you end up getting a scar that is wider and looks as though it was spread apart while it was healing. On the other hand, if you cut along tension lines, you'll often get a very fine white line, very fine little scar. Okay, blood supply to the skin. Of course, all blood supply to the skin is coming from the heart and the aorta and branching and branching. But eventually, smaller and smaller branches go, and they go to the skin. And first they go to a plexus or network of blood vessels that is found between the subcutaneous layer and the dermis. It's called the cutaneous plexus. Then, as this plexus branches into finer and finer capillaries that extend upwards through the layers of the dermis, we see a second plexus or network of blood vessels called the subpapillary plexus. It arises from vessels that were in the cutaneous plexus and then, branched and became the subpapillary plexus. And then from the subpapillary plexus, little fine branches extend. At this point, the little branches are capillaries, and the capillaries are found in little loops right underneath the epidermis. Because as we remember, epithelial tissues, of which the epidermis is one, it's a type of epithelial tissue, don't have their own vascular supply. There are no blood vessels in the tissue. So oxygen and nutrients must diffuse from capillaries that are nearby. So in this case, the oxygen and nutrients are diffusing from these capillary loops right up here underneath the epidermis. The blood that flows to the skin is involved in temperature regulation. So if our internal core body temperature rises because of exercise, because of fevers, because we're in a very hot place, the capillaries in the dermis will dilate or widen so that heat is lost from the blood through the skin. If the core body temperature falls, the capillaries in the dermis will constrict or tighten to prevent heat loss from the blood through the skin. Now, in a separate issue from temperature regulation, if there is severe blood loss, the blood vessels in the dermis constrict so that whatever blood is remaining in the body goes to vital organs like the brain, the heart, and the lungs, and not to the skin, which is a non-vital organ. I mean, of course, it's a very vital organ, but you're going to die really fast if there's no blood flow to your brain, your heart, and your lungs. So they get, first dibs on the blood. The skin contains nerves, sensory nerves that are going from the skin to the brain, and motor nerves that are going from the brain to the skin. So first we'll talk about sensory nerves. So sensory nerves carry information from the skin to the brain. And as we talked about, the epidermis contains sensory neurons that are associated with Merkel cells and also contains free nerve endings. Merkel cells, if you remember, can detect light, touch, and firmer pressure. Free nerve endings, which are the most common nerve endings in skin, can sense pain, temperature, and light touch. So they're versatile. That was the epidermis. The dermis also contains free nerve endings that monitor pain, temperature, and touch. And then the dermis contains multiple other types of sensory receptors that are either directly part of a sensory neuron or are a receptor that shares information with a sensory neuron. And here is a list of the sensory receptors. There are sensory nerves that wrap around hair follicles. Those are called the the network of nerve endings that wraps around the follicle is called a root hair plexus. It detects movement of hair. There is a sensory receptor called a tactile corpuscle, which senses light, touch, and vibration. There is a sensory receptor called a bulbous corpuscle, which senses pressure and stretch of the skin. And there's a sensory receptor called a lamellar corpuscle, which senses deep pressure and vibration. And this is the only part of chapter 18 that is used in this lecture. This is figure 18.3 from one of the chapters on the nervous system that talks about sensory receptors. Because they're in the skin, I'm including them here though. Now, moving on to the motor neurons that are found in the skin. So the skin contains autonomic nervous system neurons that carry motor commands from the brain to the skin, and they're involuntary motor commands or unconscious motor commands. We're not telling the brain that we want to do something, and then the brain is sending a command to the skin to do something. I mean, think about it. We never command our skin to do anything, right? Instead, the motor commands are going to different elements that are in the skin. So the nerves go to the blood vessels that are in skin, and they tell the blood vessels to contract or constrict, if it's cold, if there's been blood loss, or they tell the blood vessels to constrict less, to relax, so that there's more blood flow. The autonomic nervous system neurons also control secretions from glands, and they also control the contractions of erector pili muscles that are associated with hair follicles that we'll talk about when we talk about hair. Okay, so it's not part of the skin, but the subcutaneous layer we'll say a little bit about. So the subcutaneous layer is composed of loose areolar connective tissue and adipose connective tissue. And this layer separates the skin from underlying structures like muscles. By separating the skin from the underlying structures, it allows the skin to move independently from the structures. So we can move our skin. You can move the skin on your arm back and forth, right? Without moving the muscle that's underneath, right? So you can try this yourself. You can try it at home, okay? But the subcutaneous layer also stabilizes the position of the skin over the underlying structure. So although we can move our skin without moving our muscle, we can't move our skin endlessly. Like we can't just, pull it and pull it and pull it. It is still attached to the underlying structures of our body. Our skin is not disconnected from the underlying structures of the body. So the subcutaneous layer is doing two things. It's both allowing the skin and underlying structures to move independently, and it's also anchoring the skin to the underlying structure. The adipose connective tissue in the subcutaneous layer is storing energy, as fat. It's acting as insulation. This can be really important. And it's acting as a shock absorber. So in places like in our buttocks where there's a lot of fat, when we sit down, it's acting as a sort of shock absorber. Some injections are administered to the subcutaneous layer, and you'll often see an abbreviation where they'll say a medication is given sub-Q or SC for subcutaneous. Okay, so now on to